What music can I do when I see you? Welcome to Shadows of Stardom, where we uncover the untold truths hiding just beyond the spotlight. Just days before taking his final breath at the age of 86, legendary singer and songwriter Neil Sedaka sat down at his beloved piano one last time. He did not offer a tearful goodbye or speak with bitterness. Instead, he smiled warmly into the camera and shared a simple, profound message: good times, good music, and good friends. It was a serene and quiet moment, yet behind that gentle smile, a testament to a man who fought his way through the darkest corners of the entertainment industry and ultimately emerged victorious. How does a musical genius survive the crushing weight of a system that treats brilliant artists like disposable products? What does it take to maintain such pure joy at the end of a journey marked by sudden abandonment and industry betrayal? Neil Sedaka was not just a pop star. He was one of the architects of the American soundtrack during the golden transition from the late 1950s into the early 1960s. With a voice that defined a generation, he brought boundless optimism to a post-war nation through timeless melodies. The public saw a flawless icon, a hit-making machine crafting songs that felt like pure sunshine. But the glittering facade of Hollywood and the booming record industry concealed a much harsher reality. The vibrant melodies hit exhausting factory-like conditions inside the legendary Brill Building, where creativity was heavily commodified and young talents were pushed to their absolute limits. When the musical tide shifted, the same industry that crowned him king ruthlessly cast him aside into a decade of shadows. He was written off, nearly forgotten by the record labels that had built empires on his talent, yet his touching final message became the ultimate victory lap. The quiet triumph of a true survivor. To understand the emotional weight of that final performance, we must journey back to a crowded Brooklyn neighborhood where a young classical piano prodigy made a fateful decision to chase the dazzling, dangerous lights of pop music. Before he was a global sensation, Neil Sedaka was accepted into the preparatory division of Juilliard School at just 9 years old, seemingly destined for grand concert halls. But the rigid world of classical music could not contain his restless spirit, captivated by the infectious rhythms of early rock and roll. He walked through the doors of the Brill Building in New York City and teamed up with lyricist Howard Greenfield to craft songs that would define an era. The late 1950s, early 1960s were a time of cultural transformation in America. Post-war youth searched for a sound that captured innocent romance, teenage heartbreak, and endless optimism, and Neil became that voice. In 1959, he released Ooh, Carol, inspired by his high school girlfriend and future legend Carole King, and the world fell in love. He followed with hits like Calendar Girl, Happy Birthday, Sweet 16, and the chart-topping Breaking Up Is Hard to Do. To the public, he was the golden boy of American pop, the smiling boy next door with a flawless voice. His popularity transcended borders as he recorded in multiple languages, performing in Italian, Spanish, German, and Japanese, becoming an international phenomenon, yet beneath the applause pressure mounted. The Brill Building functioned as a relentless hit factory. Songwriters were placed in small rooms with upright pianos and crushing expectations, pushed to produce one chart topper after another. Executives fostered fierce competition, while restrictive contracts favored publishers, leaving young creators with little control over their own work. Neil was idolized by fans, but treated as a commodity by the corporate system. Every tour, every public appearance, every carefully polished smile was orchestrated for profit. There was no room for fatigue or evolution. In 1964, the cultural landscape shifted overnight with the explosive arrival of the Beatles and the British invasion. The innocent pop sound that had made Neil a superstar was suddenly labeled obsolete. RCA Records dropped him without ceremony or support. One day he was selling millions of records. The next he struggled to secure a contract. The roaring crowds were replaced by silence. It was a stunning betrayal, proof of how quickly the industry discards its stars, forced into professional exile. Neil sought opportunities in the United Kingdom and Australia, performing in small clubs to support his family, the sold-out arenas. of America were replaced by dimly lit venues, yet his creative spirit endured. He continued writing songs for other artists, watching from the shadows as others climbed the charts with melodies born from his gift. The industry had erased his name from the marquee, assuming he would fade quietly into history, but they underestimated his resilience. In London, a devoted admirer who had grown up studying Neil's chord progressions was rising to global superstardom. That admirer was Elton John, recognizing Neil's timeless talent. Elton signed him to his Rocket record company in the early 1970s, setting the stage for a remarkable comeback. With Laughter in the Rain, Neil returned to the top of the Billboard charts. He followed with Bad Blood, featuring Elton on backing vocals, proving that artistry has no expiration date. It was a triumphant reclamation of his power. In the twilight of his life, Neil chose not to dwell on resentment or recount betrayals. Instead, he offered a final video message filled with warmth and music. Sitting at his piano, he celebrated good times, good music, and good friends. It was a serene victory over the machine that once tried to define and discard him. He had survived the star-making factory with his spirit intact. His journey from prodigy to discarded idol to triumphant survivor is more than a personal story. It is a reminder of the unseen toll of the entertainment industry. For every artist who finds their way back, countless others fade into silence. When the spotlight dims, do we still care about the human beings behind the fame? What if the industry valued creators as souls rather than products? Neil Sedaka's life stands as a beacon for those who have been overshadowed or left behind. He reclaimed his narrative and proved that true artistry cannot be owned or erased. As the final notes of his piano gently faded, he left behind not vengeance, but gratitude and joy. His legacy is not merely in the hits that once dominated the charts, but in the quiet strength of a man who insisted on telling his story in his own voice and playing his music exactly as he wished. In the end, what makes his story so powerful is not just the comeback or the chart-topping hits, but the quiet dignity with which he carried both triumph and rejection. Neil Sedaka understood something that many artists spend a lifetime chasing. Fame is fleeting, but craftsmanship endures. Long after the screaming fans grew silent and the industry executives shifted their attention to the next sensation, the songs remained. They played at weddings, at birthday parties, on late-night radio shows, and in the private moments of people who had grown up with his voice as the soundtrack to their youth, even during the years when America seemed to forget him, never truly disappeared. They lived quietly in jukeboxes, in old vinyl collections, in the memories of teenagers who had once slow danced to breaking up is hard to do. Time, which had once seemed like his greatest enemy, slowly became his ally. Nostalgia turned into reverence. The very innocence that executives once dismissed as outdated began to feel timeless. As decades passed, a new generation of artists openly acknowledged the foundation he helped build. The polished pop structures, the unforgettable hooks, the emotional clarity packed into 3-minute songs, these were not accidents. They were the result of disciplined classical training blended with fearless pop instinct. The boy who once studied at the Juilliard School never truly left that discipline. Behind, he simply reshaped it into something accessible to the world. What makes his final message so hauntingly beautiful is its simplicity. After surviving the ruthless competition of the Brill Building, the humiliation of being dropped by RCA Records, and the long exile before being embraced again through the faith of Elton John, he did not choose bitterness. He did not frame himself as a victim of the system. He framed himself as a man grateful for the journey. There is something deeply disarming about that choice. In an era where public figures often use their final chapters to settle scores or expose old wounds, he chose gratitude over grievance. That decision may be his most radical act of all. Quietly exposes the industry's flaws without ever naming them, highlights exploitation without sounding resentful, proves resilience without demanding applause. His life forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the entertainment machine. Many other brilliant voices were lost when trends shifted. How many prodigies were discarded because their sound no longer fit a marketing plan? The British invasion, led by bands like the Beatles, changed music forever, but it also left casualties in its wake. Neil Sedaka could have been one of them permanently. Instead, he became a rare example of survival, and perhaps that is why his final piano performance resonates so deeply. It was not just a farewell, it was a full-circle moment. A classically trained child from Brooklyn, who once traded symphonies for pop hooks, returned to the simplest version of himself, a man, and his piano, no elaborate stage design, no manufactured image, no industry interference, just music. When he said good times, good music, and good friends, it sounded almost effortless. But behind those words stood decades of endurance. They carried the weight of rejection letters, empty calendars, and uncertain futures. They carried the triumph of #1 records reclaimed against all odds. They carried the quiet knowledge that he had outlasted the system that once tried to define his limits. In the end, his story is not about revenge or redemption in the dramatic Hollywood sense. It is about ownership. He reclaimed ownership of his art, his narrative, and his joy. The industry may have controlled contracts and charts, but it never truly owned his gift. As the final notes of his piano faded, what remained was not scandal, not controversy, not unresolved bitterness. What remained was legacy. A catalog of songs that continued to echo across generations, a blueprint for resilience in an industry built on impermanence, and a reminder that while fame can be manufactured, authenticity cannot. Neil Sedaka did not just survive the golden cage of pop stardom. He walked out of it with his spirit intact. In doing so, he left behind something far more powerful than a hit record. He left behind proof that true artistry, when rooted in passion and perseverance, can withstand even the coldest silence. And maybe that is the part of his story that lingers the longest. Not the screaming fans, not the chart statistics, it's not even the comeback headlines. What lingers is the image of Neil Sedaka sitting quietly at a piano, decades after the industry first crowned him and then cast him aside, still completely at peace with the gift that started it all. Because in the end, the entertainment world measures success in numbers, sales, streams, rankings, awards. But an artist measures it differently. An artist measures it in moments. The hush that falls over a room when the first chord is struck. In the way a melody can instantly transport someone back to their first love, their first heartbreak, their teenage bedroom radio playing late into the night. Neil understood that distinction. He had lived on both sides of the equation. He had been the industry's golden investment and its discarded inventory. He had tasted the blinding speed of overnight fame and the suffocating stillness of professional exile. That duality gave him something rare: perspective. When he re-emerged in the 1970s with renewed success, was not the wide-eyed ambition of a young man chasing stardom. It was the steady confidence of someone who had already lost everything once and survived. The partnership with Elton John was more than a career move. It was validation from a new generation that recognized the architecture of pop brilliance. He had helped design. His resurgence was not luck. It was proof that foundation matters. Trends fade, but structure endures. And still, even after reclaiming his place on the charts, he never allowed bitterness to define his legacy. That restraint speaks volumes. The temptation to expose, to criticize, to relive the betrayals must have been immense. The early days at the Brill Building had taught him how quickly creativity could be commodified. Being dropped by RCA Records had shown him how fragile corporate loyalty truly was. Watching the cultural earthquake caused by the Beatles' reshape, the entire American soundscape had demonstrated how merciless change could be, yet he chose grace. Perhaps that is the ultimate. Rebellion, in an industry built on ego and spectacle, to remain gracious, to continue creating without demanding validation, to find joy in the act itself, rather than in the applause that may or may not follow. His later years were not about reclaiming lost glory. They were about preservation, preserving the integrity of the songs, preserving the memory of an era when pop music carried innocence without irony, preserving the idea that success does not have to corrupt the soul of the creator. For audiences, his life poses an uncomfortable reflection. We celebrate meteoric rises, but we rarely witness the quiet aftermath. We consume the hits but often ignore the human cost of producing them. The machine thrives on novelty, constantly searching for the next big sound, the next marketable face. But what happens to the architects once their blueprint becomes standard? Neil Sedaka answered that question not with outrage, but with endurance. He stayed long enough to see his music rediscovered, reappreciated, and reframed as timeless rather than outdated. He lived long enough to sit at that piano one final time, not as a relic of a forgotten era, but as a respected elder of pop history. There is something profoundly powerful about closing your story on your own terms. He was not dragged into obscurity. He was not defined by scandal. He was not reduced to a cautionary tale. He authored his final chapter with the same simplicity that defined his earliest hits. Good times, good music, good friends. Those words are deceptively light, but they carry the weight of survival, of forgiveness, of perspective earned through hardship. They are the distilled essence of a life that could have easily turned bitter, but instead turned reflective. And so when we listen now, when one of his melodies drifts through a speaker or resurfaces in a nostalgic playlist, we are not just hearing a pop song from another era. We are hearing resilience set to music. We are hearing the echo of a young Brooklyn prodigy who dared to step into the glittering machinery of fame and somehow walked out whole. His story reminds us that the spotlight is temporary, but the soul behind the song can be eternal.